imagine, like, having this incredibly powerful supercomputer, right? One that can process trillions of calculations a millisecond.
Right, a total powerhouse.
Exactly. But it completely crashes, just blue screens every single time you try to open a basic text document.
Oh, man. That would be infuriating.
It would be. And honestly, that is essentially the state of modern society right now. I mean, we're living in this era of just unprecedented abundance.
Yeah, totally.
We have, more laws on the books designed to keep us safe. We have massive amounts of wealth circulating in the global economy. And frankly, literal technological magic right at our fingertips.
We really do.
Yet, if you look around, it feels like we are constantly, one bad day away from total systemic collapse. So the question we are taking head on today, right out of the gate, is why? With all these advanced tools, why does human civilization still feel so fundamentally broken to you and me?
It is, it's really the defining paradox of our era, isn't it?
Oh, 100%.
We are relentlessly applying these external structural fixes to problems that simply refuse to respond to external solutions. We, pass a new regulation, or we tweak an economic policy, maybe adjust a border wall, and we just expect human nature to suddenly harmonize.
Like it's just going to magically fix everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the source material we are diving into today argues that this approach means we are completely, totally missing the root cause of our societal dysfunction. We're trying to fix the symptoms while completely ignoring the disease.
Yeah. So let's get into that. The text we're exploring is this really fascinating translated essay from November 2024. It's by an author named Shuifeng, and it's titled Cultivating the Soul Garden for a Civilized World.
A very poetic title.
Right. And the entire mission of this deep dive today is to explore his radical premise. Because he basically argues that trying to fix the tangible, external elements of society like governance or wealth distribution, it's a complete waste of time if we ignore the internal consciousness of humanity.
Which is a huge claim to make.
It is. It's like going back to that supercomputer analogy. Trying to fix society with new laws and wealth is like trying to upgrade a computer's hardware. Buying a faster processor, adding RAM, when the software itself is fundamentally infected with malware.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how shiny the hardware is, the system is still going to crash.
And the malware in that scenario is exactly what this essay targets.
Mm-hmm.
This text is so interesting because it demands that we look inward before we even attempt to fix anything outward. It really challenges our basic, ingrained assumptions about human progress.
Yeah, it kind of flips the whole script.
It does. To understand why our societal hardware keeps failing us, we have to look really closely at what the author considers the software. And like you mentioned from the title, he refers to this internal consciousness as the soul garden.
Okay, let's unpack this, because soul garden sounds, very abstract, maybe a bit flowery, but the author actually treats it as this very rigid mechanism. So how exactly does this garden operate, practically speaking?
So, the author posits that a person's actions are entirely, and unequivocally, driven by their consciousness. And this consciousness functions literally like a plot of land.
Yeah, an actual garden.
Right. The state of this internal space is dictated entirely by the thoughts, values, and desires that you're planting and watering there. The core concept here is this absolute law of cause and effect. Unseen factors determine visible phenomena.
Unseen dictates the scene.
Exactly. The invisible seed dictates the visible harvest.
Okay, so if I plant a seed of resentment, the visible harvest is like me isolating myself or snapping at a coworker tomorrow.
Precisely. That's the mechanism. And the author argues that most of humanity right now is currently cultivating what he calls weeds.
Right, and he has a whole list of these, doesn't he?
He does. He specifically lists things like the worship of money, the thirst for power, having this inflated sense of superiority, constant comparison, envy, greed.
Basically the worst hits of human nature.
Yeah, pretty much. And he says if those are the seeds taking root in a person's consciousness, harm to society isn't just like a possibility. It is an absolute inevitability. When the unseen garden is consumed by weeds, the visible phenomenon that erupts into the real world is destructive behavior.
So to fix the behavior, you can't just slap a rule on it. You have to literally pull the weeds.
Yes. You have to actively plant flowers instead. Things like truth, compassion, and, a genuine reverence for life.
I have to admit, when I was reading this section, I felt some heavy resistance. I really want to push back on this absolute law of cause and effect a little bit.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because isn't it a bit overly idealistic to claim that visible phenomena in society are solely determined by these unseen internal factors?
You mean like ignoring external circumstances.
Exactly. Let's look at crushing systemic poverty. If someone is starving and they steal a loaf of bread, they aren't doing that because their internal garden is overgrown with the weed of greed, right? They're doing it because their external reality is forcing their hand just to survive.
That's a really fair point, and it's interesting because the author's framework actually anticipates that exact scenario.
Wait, really? How?
Well, he doesn't dismiss the reality of the starving person. Rather, he traces the causal chain further up the ladder. In his view, systemic issues like poverty or extreme inequality, those aren't root causes.
They're symptoms.
Exactly. They are downstream symptoms of neglected soul gardens within the ruling and merchant classes.
Okay, but does that actually help the starving person? It feels kind of like blaming a massive regional drought entirely on the corrupt officials who mismanaged the dam while completely ignoring the people who are currently dying of thirst.
I see what you mean.
Does the text offer any grace for the people at the bottom of this cascade who are just trying to survive?
It's less about grace and more about offering a pretty brutal diagnosis of the whole ecosystem. The text argues that the starving person stealing bread is the visible phenomenon caused by the unseen greed of the powerful people hoarding the resources.
Ah, okay, so it traces back.
Right. If the individuals designing the systems have internal gardens choked by power hunger, the system they build will naturally manufacture poverty. He's uncompromising on this. You simply cannot legislate poverty away without fundamentally changing the consciousness of the people controlling the wealth.
Which means the damage scale is based on how much power the uncultivated person holds.
Exactly.
If the people managing the dam are poisoning the water supply with their own internal greed, that toxicity cascades into everyone's daily life. And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a second here, especially if you are an entrepreneur, a manager, or just someone navigating a modern workplace.
Because the author actually calls them out specifically.
He does. He addresses entrepreneurs directly and asks them to really reflect, where does the vast majority of your time and energy actually go every day?
And spoiler alert, the answer is rarely innovation.
Right. The author points out that most of that energy is squandered on managing toxic interpersonal relationships, navigating deep-seated mistrust, and just constantly shielding yourself from fraud. The tax we pay on interacting with uncultivated soul gardens is pure exhaustion, and the text goes into grim detail about how these symptoms manifest across society.
Yeah, it's quite a list. He notes how officials become tyrannical and corrupt.
And intellectuals, instead of actually seeking objective truth, they just end up flattering the powerful and distorting facts.
Because if a scholar's garden is overgrown with the weed of superiority or status, the biological drive to social climb replaces intellectual inquiry. They start twisting data just to secure funding.
And the same thing applies to commerce, right? The text points out how merchants and corporations resort to fraud selling counterfeit or even harmful goods.
And ordinary people aren't spared in this critique either. Without a cultivated garden, people just start scheming against each other. They devolve into violent mobs plagued by vices like gambling, drug abuse, extortion.
Yeah, one of the most haunting analogies for me was how this rot eventually reduces all relationships, family, friends, romantic, to just mere tools for personal gain.
It's incredibly bleak.
It really is. Society essentially becomes this giant high-stakes casino where everyone is just terrified. The powerful fear the annihilation of their legacies. The wealthy are terrified of kidnapping.
Because they know they're surrounded by people driven by the exact same predatory weeds they have. It's a state of perpetual anxiety that no amount of money can fix.
Right. So if a single person's greed can turn a family into a battlefield, what happens when you scale that up, when you hand that uncultivated mindset the keys to a nation-state?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the author pivots to a massive critique of the macro structures we rely on to keep order.
Like nations and religions.
Exactly. He asserts that these institutions are simply grand external attempts to manage internal rot, and that they're actually completely futile.
Okay, let's look at nations first.
The text asks, what have nations genuinely contributed to humanity beyond creating artificial barriers, heavily armed borders, and war? They've existed for millennia, but mostly just bring plunder.
And just to be clear here, the author points specifically to the mindset of prioritizing the national self over the global whole. He actually uses the phrase America first as an example in the text.
He does, yeah.
And we really need to pause here for a quick disclaimer, because obviously that touches on modern politics, and we want to make it very, very clear to you listening. We are not taking any political sides here on nationalism or foreign policy.
Absolutely not.
We are strictly, impartially reporting the author's philosophical argument, which claims that prioritizing national interest inevitably leads to ruthless competition and even nuclear blackmail. He's saying external borders cannot fix internal rot.
Right, we're just exploring his logic. And his logic applies to religion, too. He argues that rather than bringing peace, religious institutions often just numb the soul with rigid dogma and close people's minds.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Criticizing nations and religion is one thing, but the author goes a massive step further and claims that the very concept of laws like the legal systems holding civilization together are completely futile.
Yeah, he challenges us to look at the empirical results. We have millions of statutes and penal codes.
Yeah.
Have they stopped wars? Have they guaranteed that the average person is genuinely happy?
Clearly not.
According to the text, the answer is a demonstrable no. So relying on external laws is a failed experiment.
But he isn't just saying we should have total anarchy, is he? He actually redefines what a law is.
He does. He proposes this radical redefinition. True law is only a pathway or a measure that actively enables people to live happily, freely, and joyfully.
Wow.
That's his sole metric. Anything that hinders freedom, joy, or happiness, he says you can't even rightfully call it a law.
That is wild. I mean, apply that to everyday life. Paying income tax does not bring me joy. Traffic tickets don't bring me joy. Are they invalid under this?
Well, the author would argue that in a cultivated society, contributing resources would bring you joy. You wouldn't need a punitive tax code if our internal gardens weren't full of the weed of greed.
Ah, I see. It all traces back to the garden.
Exactly.
So to practically illustrate this radical redefinition of true law and the futility of borders, the deep dive moves to this highly specific, highly provocative test case, the concept of illegal immigration.
And again, we're entering some heavily charged territory here.
Yes, so impartiality disclaimer number 2. Immigration is obviously a massive political issue globally. Our role here is strictly to impartially explore the unique, almost sci-fi logic presented in the source material without endorsing it.
Right, and the logic he uses is pretty out there. He starts with the idea that if legal migration actually worked, no one would risk their lives to move.
Which makes sense.
But then he pans way out. He says Earth is just a small village within the vast cosmos. And if it's one small village, free migration should be the true legal framework.
Because it promotes freedom and joy.
Exactly. And then he drops this massive claim.
Yeah.
If illegal immigration is a crime, then literally all humans are guilty.
Wait, all of us?
Yeah, because Earth initially had no inhabitants. So we are all, essentially, illegal immigrants from other planets who settled here. It's the ultimate aliens argument.
That is, I mean, from orbit, there are no lines drawn in the dirt, right? But he actually brings it down to a specific earthly example. He zeroes in on the United States.
He does. He highlights that, aside from indigenous peoples, the U.S. is essentially a massive stronghold built entirely by people who were technically illegal immigrants or colonizers.
Right, and the text poses this sharp challenge. If past illegal immigration made the U.S. so incredibly strong, why is it suddenly unjustified now?
What's fascinating here is his ultimate challenge, he asks. Why not allow unrestricted migration? Why not let everyone immigrate to the U.S. and transform the whole planet into a united America?
Just erase the borders completely.
Yeah, because historically, he argues, places that strictly restrict outsiders and lock their gates rarely become civilized or prosperous in the long run. The border wall is just a physical symptom of the internal weed of fear.
Wow. We have traveled from the internal garden of a single person's mind all the way out to the cosmic village of Earth. So what does this all mean? How do we bring this back down to reality, to the listener?
Well, the author's conclusion is a huge call to action. He says history must be critically examined, authority must be questioned, and reality heavily scrutinized.
Can't just keep patching the hardware.
Right. We need a collective purification of humanity's soul. That is his path to achieving a world with harmonious weather, lasting peace, and a beautiful life for everyone.
A collective purification. 8 billion people actively pulling the weeds of greed and envy out of their soul gardens. It's a beautiful vision. But, it leaves me with a final thought, something for you to mull over as you go about your day.
What's that?
The author demands this collective purification to achieve a civilized utopia. But we're talking about a global village of 8 billion completely unique soul gardens. Who exactly gets to decide what is a weed and what is a flower?
Oof. Yeah. One person's weed might have been the very thing that kept someone else's ancestors alive.
Exactly. And if we try to enforce that internal purification from the top down, mandating which thoughts are weeds that must be eradicated, aren't we just creating another one of those exact external feudal laws the author is warning us against?
It's a total paradox.
It really is. You can't force a flower to grow by passing a law, and you can't force humanity to be good by policing their internal gardens. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the systems around you, but maybe more importantly, keep a very close eye on what is currently taking root in your own internal garden. Until next time.